but it can be sort of framed as almost a thing that you're responsible for yourself in your own being, because it is a group phenomenon. It only exists as part of a group. It kind of doesn't make sense to kind of frame it as an individual thing, a kind of individual resilience, or something that you can create yourself through through effort or meditation or something. Meditation is a great thing to do, but you're not going to feel more psychologically safe in a group just because you've spent some time meditating. I can recommend meditation, but it's not going to achieve that
Yeah.
particular goal.
Okay. So
Yeah,
it's a dynamic that sits between people,
yeah,
but you'd probably feel it on an individual level as to whether
yeah,
it's there or not.
yeah, yeah.
Hello there, and a very warm welcome, or welcome back to the podcast. My name is Steve Ingham. I'm an applied scientist and leader from the world of high performance sport. And on the podcast, I explore all aspects of human performance, whether that is getting stronger, fitter, mentally more prepared, eating better, playing better, leading and coaching in different ways, but also how we perform in work, individually and as teams. And the way I do that is by speaking with great scientists, practitioners, researchers, coaches, athletes, and entrepreneurs. I'm also keen to talk to people from outside of sports, people who are just interested in how we perform as humans. If you enjoy the podcast, then please do share it with friends and colleagues and be sure to subscribe. And if you want to support and champion us, then please do leave a review on iTunes. This week's guest is Tom Geraghty. Now, Tom runs a business that supports and coaches people and teams in the area of psychological safety, and he's created a reputation in this niche through his work, his online contributions, and a very impactful newsletter that he sends out each week. Tom hasn't come at this topic through what you might think is the traditional and formal psychological route. So he's seen leaders misuse their position, create caustic environments, and make people feel not only rubbish but inhibited too. And then Tom had the good sense and the will to learn why, how, what, and when these environments arise, and how he can support people to make things better, to feel safer, so that you can unlock their potential and their performance. I really enjoyed this conversation with Tom. His deep thinking really added value, and I hope you enjoy it too. All right, well, welcome to the podcast, Tom. How are you?
I'm fab, and yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really chuffed to be here. It's superb.
Thank you so much. And I do like to think about trying to extend the network of people that I'm connected to, rather than sort of Steve's mates or can you come on the podcast, and I think just taking an opportunity to reach out to someone who I've just got this sort of gut sense of it'd be interesting to chat to you. You're creating some great content on Twitter, and your newsletter's superb, and getting some great traction. And so I thought I'll just throw out a contact and see. And you were good enough to respond with a yes. So thank you so much for that random contact agreement.
That's cool. I really appreciate it, and I'm really pleased to hear that you enjoyed the newsletter too. Yeah, it's that was that started as very much kind of a, oh, I wonder what this will be like if I start a newsletter, and it's turned out all right.
Yeah, and I say try to extend my network. Within one email, we'd realised that we've got a common connection in Christopher, and you live just up the road. So,
Yeah, yeah, it is a small world. Yeah, definitely.
well, I've tried, and so your connection with Chris does that mean you've got a sporting background too?
So I only in a very sort of hobbyist kind of way, but so my connection with Chris is that we went to uni together, and we were both in the cycling club, which is more really like a mountain biking club. And so Chris was in the year above me at uni, and he did sports science. I actually did biological sciences at uni, but yeah, and he was the president of the cycling club in the year before I became the president of the cycling club. So we've done a few races together, and some fun times together at uni. And I was there when he broke his collarbone as well. Uh, on some ill-advised mountain bike jumps in Nottingham.
Up at Sherwood.
In fact, right in the centre of town,
Oh no.
at the what's it called, the Goose Fair site in Nottingham. There was a little BMX track there, and we were all having a great time until disaster struck, and it struck Chris hard.
Fantastic. So you're there to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting, interesting. And so maybe that's an interesting jumping off point around. So you've studied biological sciences. So you sort of have you gone from the body to the head, or you've just gone up the neck? Be interesting to sort of hear your career and route to this idea of working and supporting people around psychological safety.
Yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, so that's a really good question actually. And so yeah, I've had a maybe a convoluted career. So my career after uni kicked off in. So I started off in sort of biological science research, sort of researching different weeds and fertilizers and crops and stuff. And then moved into field trials. So I kind of worked on farms, basically sort of research farms for quite a while, which was great. And I actually learned a lot there. It was a great time, but also physically really hard work. Ended up moving into sort of tech project management when I got involved in a project that was sort of monitoring crops remotely using tech, trying to use SMS, trying to use text messages. But it was way before its time. It was effectively the Internet of Things back in sort of 2002, 2003. So far before its time. That kicked off a career in tech, and I sort of moved up through ranks or whatever you call it, and into management roles. Ended up managing infrastructure teams, engineering teams, development teams, and so my entry into the sort of world of psychological safety, although I didn't know it at the time, was when I had a really, so maybe sort of 13 or so years ago, I had a really shouty, screamy, stereotypical bad boss. You know, the boss that. So it was a big open plan office, and he had a fancy glass cubicle on the side, the status symbol office. And every now and then he'd storm out of his office and rip someone apart, absolutely tear someone apart for some minor mistake or infraction or for something going wrong. And that so that was a horrible place to be. Like that sounds like a horrible place to work. And we all can understand that would be a horrible place to work. What I realized at the time when I was there was that the effect that was having on the team and on the whole business was a very calcifying, slowing down, suppressive effect on everything from innovation. So no one wanted to try any new things in case it went wrong or failed. No one even wanted to sort of even to fix anything, even to patch something or update something, because the risk of it going wrong, the fear of getting shouted at and screamed at was greater than the fear of the thing going wrong. You know what I mean? So that meant that no one ever tried anything. So everything got really out of date. Everything got left behind. Tech got left behind. Other competitors were leaving us in the dust because we were effectively moving backwards compared to them. And so I realized that if that was the bad way of doing things, that's the way to failure, organizational failure, team failure, anti-pattern to performance. The good way, the right way, if there is a right way, must be the opposite of that, or to some degree the opposite of that. So from then on, the sort of years after that, I would often think to myself, what's the opposite of what that guy would do?
Interesting.
I'll do it that way.
And was that,
And
so can I just ask you then,
yeah,
was that, I'm just conscious of 2002, the environment there in tech, you're probably going to feel falling behind really quickly during that period where there's an acceleration of
yeah.
those results. Was that the principal driver, or were you sat there just thinking, I don't like this. I'm nervous going into work. This doesn't feel as though I'm inspired to go the extra mile. And in fact, when I get in the car, I don't care. I actively want to shut off rather than,
Yeah.
oh, I've got this idea about work.
Yeah. Yeah. So the fundamental driver there, like you say, is essentially that I didn't like the atmosphere. I didn't want to be there. I didn't enjoy work. I didn't gain any fulfillment from it, and I didn't. You get that Sunday night dread, and those sort of symptoms, and so I knew on a very human level that the right thing to do would be to create the opposite of that, which was a safe environment, an environment where it's safe to try things and suggest ideas, and a safe to fail environment. So I knew that was the human thing to do. I knew that was the sort of environment I wanted to work in. What kind of worked in my favor was that evidently that's also the path to success. It feels good. It's nice for us to enjoy our jobs and enjoy what we do, but it also leads to performance and success. So it's, if someone's asking me for a business case for a safe environment, then there it is. Of course, at the time, I didn't know the word psychological safety. I don't think many people did, actually. Um, and uh, and it was only maybe 6 or so years ago that I came across the term psychological safety, and that was a proper light bulb moment. You don't have many of them in your career and in your life when it's really like, oh, this is it. And that was, I realized, like, as soon as I came across it, as soon as I came across this definition, it was actually one of Amy Edmondson's TED talks, sort of a 10-minute TED talk, and I thought, this is it. This is what I've been trying to do, and now finally I understand that there's a word for it, there's a term for it. I can hang my hat on this particular hook. And since then, I've seen it's through that door of opening. I've seen it's not just effective for sort of tech teams, engineering teams, and those sort of teams. It's across every industry. It's across aerospace, aviation, healthcare, and sports.
And elite sport, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's how we sort of surfaced this as a concept when we debriefed the teams post Beijing, particularly an intensive debrief before you go towards the big one at 2012, and it was a case of, well, how do you feel? And people said, I feel fearful.
Mm.
I feel fearful, and I don't want to go the extra mile. And then we start unpacking that, and that's in teams that are underperforming. The teams that are overperforming, I'm encouraged to take risks. Okay, that's interesting. And so then psychologists said, oh, that's psychological safety. Right. How do we brew that in teams?
Yeah.
So let's do a bit of hygiene here because you mentioned Amy Edmondson, and I'm also really conscious that when I'm talking to people about team development, team dynamics, the idea of psychological safety comes up. It sort of it's one of those terms that seems to have entered into the corporate consciousness, but it's one of the terms that people are using to mop up everything. And it's a bit like resilience, where it's sort of interpreted as grit and toughness in the face of pressure, though the definition is about specifically recovering quickly from a setback so that teams and leaders need to sustain performance in that way. So can you just give us a crisp view and definition of what it is? And I'll ask you maybe afterwards what it isn't as well, so it's
Yeah.
so that people are clear and this can potentially be helpful for them.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you've raised this because, just like you say, we are seeing, and this happens. In fact, I think there's a term for this as well, and I think the term is semantic diffusion, where a term enters the sort of common language, and because people hear the term without hearing the definition or fully understanding it, then the term itself gets diluted or becomes sort of, the meaning sort of diverges into something else. And psychological safety is an example of that. So the canonical definition that most of us sort of in the field would agree with is something around the lines of um, safe to or yeah, the knowledge or the feeling that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And that is to say that it's how you feel, how someone feels about the rest of the group and how they respond to you. So it's kind of like the echo of trust. Trust is a component of psychological safety. Like, I can trust that this person will behave in this way, but psychological safety is is that is that group belief that it is safe in this environment for everyone to raise these concerns, raise these mistakes without interpersonal negative interpersonal consequences. Um, I One of the things, in fact, so this is a sporting kind of a sporting analogy, I guess. So if you're into climbing, if you're climbing and you've got someone belaying you with a rope, so they're holding you with that rope, and you're attached to the rope, and you're attached to a safety point on the rock, and you could trust that your belayer will hold you if you fall. So that's like, you're trusting that they've got your life in their hands. So that's a high degree of trust. However, you might not feel psychologically safe to sort of shout down to them and say, I'm not confident in jumping in, going for that hold. Or I need to take a break. I need to rest my arms a bit. So can you like hold me for a moment? That's a whole, like, it's another layer from there. So that's, yeah, that.
Yeah, that's a nice example in that it's an agreed aspect of trust, because you could say in perhaps quite simple environments where actually we don't necessarily need complex decision making dynamics. We just need you to do this simple job. Off you go. Um, yeah, can I take a risk with this
Hmm.
lathe? That's probably not the best. So there's an agreed level of trust and an aspect. So that sort of grounds it into that aspect of norms, doesn't it? In
Hmm.
that way of we're all in this together. This is how it works around here. This is something that we sign up to and subscribe to, and that to me that feels like often an active process. You've got to keep nurturing it. I think what one of my observations over time is that you can see it arise spontaneously where the sort of social interactions and the discussions allow and give permission to that arise,
Hmm.
or you work at it.
Yeah.
You work at it and you give time in your team's efforts to nurture it and discuss how are we getting on, how are we working as much as what are we doing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And one of the most powerful ways to nurture psychological safety is to talk about psychological safety, and is to make it a safe thing to talk about in the team. And this is why in many environments, such as aviation, such as healthcare, which interestingly are some of the most safety critical environments, the environments where failure has really high consequences. What's interesting is that in those domains, um, they've been doing this for years.
Yeah.
They've made this explicit for a long time. They've recognized very strongly and early that that we need to make it interpersonally safe to take, well, to take safe to fail risks, but also to admit mistakes, highlight concerns, come up with ideas. Because if we suppress those, then the really big disasters, the really big failures, you won't see coming.
Mm.
So we need to create those cultures, and we need to explicitly do it. And in healthcare, there's a thing called just culture, which is from Sidney Decker's ideas, which is essentially the sort of term for a organization-wide psychological safety that is safe to raise concerns. And in aviation, there's, we talk about things like cockpit culture. So these it's just giving it a name is a really powerful way to start building it. I think
Yeah.
that's the lesson there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly that type of research in disaster debriefs and so on. It's fascinating in the sense that
Mm.
there's just an equity between emotional, interpersonal dynamics. Sorry, we're just going to elevate those to the same level as a nut and a bolt and a fuel check and an
Mm.
engine check. The mechanics and the technical side of it, we respect because it holds the plane together. But if we don't do these things, it also means that lives are lost. And so there's
Yeah.
such a simple filter that means it just gets treated in the same way. Perhaps in some businesses, some sporting environments where actually it doesn't get exposed because someone just hasn't jumped a bit further, or we perhaps are not feeling the pinch of a profit not being quite as high. It doesn't necessarily get as exposed in that way.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that in some of the um, lowest sort of material consequence domains, and I include a lot of tech domains in there, because whilst it might have financial impact on a business if your app goes down for 5 minutes, chances are, unless it's a very safety critical app, chances are no one's going to die as a result of that. No one's going to, lives aren't going to be lost. Livelihoods aren't going to be lost. It's a bad thing. We don't want it to happen, but it's not a massive deal really in the grand scheme of things. However, and I kind of, and to not sort of, I don't want to denigrate sort of massive sporting achievements, but like if you don't win a gold medal, people aren't going to die. Like people, you're not putting lives
Oh
on the
no,
line.
you go for it. That's fair enough. If the ball
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
go in, you just got
But
some miserable people the next day. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But no one actually gets hurt by the goal not going in. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And this is where I think it's interesting, where these domains, the less safety critical domains, are some of the last to pick up this idea of psychological safety. And I wonder if it's because if actually the consequences of a lack of psychological safety aren't as so um, so viscerally felt in some of these less sort of safety critical domains. Whereas in like nuclear power, for example, if someone sees a red light flashing but thinks, I won't speak up about that because it's probably nothing.
Right.
That's the stuff where we really want people to be able to say, actually, I am going to speak up about that, even if it makes me look stupid.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting because it's sort of in some ways I never really thought of this before, but it's emerging in my head now, so I'll just fly with it. But that sense of I'm not really feeling the pressure, so we're not going to explore it, and maybe we can get into pressure and how that might affect
Mm,
how teams respond. But I remember the conversation I had with Dan Cable around this. He had this life-threatening disease. He had cancer, and then suddenly you have this epiphany, this road to Damascus moment. I'm going to live differently, and it's easy perhaps when you're faced. Not easy. It's so in your face. If you don't change the way you live, you might not live on. That sort
mm.
of fatal consequence of actually staring death in the face. Whereas, I just have a couple more biscuits, or I just have a couple more. I
Yeah,
won't do the exercise, or I won't look after myself as well. And that in that sense of not feeling the pressures of that. Um,
yeah. And there's so Amy Edmondson has done some work around this as well, and there's a great infographic that I saw recently, which is, so essentially Amy Edmondson is talking about the so if you imagine a scenario where, and it's a bit like the scenario you just gave, where suggesting a new idea or trying a new technique, that so the interpersonal consequences of, say, having an idea and putting it on the table for everyone to critique, the interpersonal consequences of that are relatively severe, but well, they're more immediate. They're right now. You feel the consequences right now. The moment you put that idea on the table, or the moment you admit your mistake, you feel those consequences right now. The return on that, the benefit of that, of admitting your mistake, or putting an idea on the table, is quite far away in the future and somewhat ambiguous. So if, like, the internal cost benefit that we do in our heads of thinking, oh, I could admit that I'm struggling, or if you're training, I I could admit that I've got a bit of a tweaked ankle or something, but actually, if I do that right now, people might think less of me. But the benefit of that, if you do it, is that you can get some proper support, some proper training. You can work around it. You might even be able to improve, and the actual outcome is even better. But that's long term. That's vague and ambiguous, and in the future. So that internal cost benefit, cost now is more important or has more consequence than a benefit much later on. Effectively, it's the sort of cost benefit we're doing in our head when we're talking about these sorts of things.
So that's interesting from the point of view of status within the group, because if you take a risk without the conditions, without the permission, then you're potentially setting yourself up for immediate humiliation.
Yeah,
That sort of,
yeah,
come on, anyone got any questions? Or there's no stupid questions. Oh, that's a stupid question. That
yeah.
type of response. And I'm just reflecting back of one of these words that stayed in my mind that you've mentioned, of calcifying, which is a beautiful description of, actually, sod it, I'm not going to do any work. I'm not going to do it. That learned helplessness of,
Mm.
oh, we're going to be like that, are we? So fine, I'm going to cross my arms. I'll come in, I'll collect my paycheck, but that's it. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious to know about how that reflects our willingness to take a risk to promote our status in the group, but also to avoid our demotion within the group.
Yeah, and this is so that's kind of it's almost it's almost the crux of it, really, because psychological safety, when people are in a psychologically unsafe environment, you're really talking about, like, people's strategies, interpersonal strategies, will be to maintain the status quo, maintain their position in the group, and avoid loss rather than maximize gain. Because in order to maximize gain, we have to take risks. We have to come up with our own ideas. We have to say, I'm going to try this, even though I have a feeling it might not work, but it might work. It's worth a punt. It's worth a bet. And so we need to, by creating psychological safety, we're sort of flipping the stance from that minimization of loss to the maximization of gain, or result or outcomes, whatever we're trying to achieve. And that's what I saw back in the company I was at 15 or whatever years ago. This baselining, we'll do the bare minimum. We'll do the bare minimum to stay safe in our jobs, but no more, because that's risky.
Yeah. Okay. And so, can we do the flip of what it isn't? I mean,
Yeah,
it's pretty obvious. It's not health and safety. So, which is one of the terms I've heard. It's
yeah.
psychological safety within health and safety. I suppose one of the most common that I sort of pushbacks when I talk about this area or the conditions in teams is, oh, well, we don't want to make things comfortable.
Mm.
So we don't want to make that, we need a little bit of challenge. And I come up, maybe get into that, but any other aspects that seem to sort of get mopped up into psychological safety that probably warrant their own separate consideration, or at least, thinking about it in a different way.
Yeah. So I appreciate this question as well, because so the one of the main things, one of the main objections that I see to it is just like that. It's about sort of, well, we don't want to make it too comfortable, which comes from a belief, from a sensation that psychological safety is sort of a wellness thing, just sort of a health and mental well-being kind of initiative, or a sort of that which, and like, it does contribute to health and mental well-being, absolutely, but it's not just that. It is about raising performance standards as well. And in fact, so that's the next thing. It's not about lowering standards. It's not about accepting a lower standard of work or effort, or striving, or it's, in fact, it's about raising the standard, but accepting that in trying to reach that standard, we may fail and stutter. We may have to take repeated attempts to get there. It's also not an individual thing, and this is something I see sometimes, that people think sort of, or it can be sort of framed as almost a thing that you're responsible for yourself in your own being. But it's like, because it is a group phenomenon, it only exists as part of a group. It kind of doesn't make sense to kind of frame it as an individual thing, a kind of individual resilience, or something that you can create yourself through through effort or meditation or something. Those things are like, that's meditation is a great thing to do, but you're not going to feel more psychologically safe in a group just because you've spent some time meditating. I can recommend meditation, but it's not going to
Yeah,
achieve
yeah,
that
yeah.
particular goal.
Okay. So
Yeah,
it's a dynamic that sits between people,
yeah,
but you'd probably feel it on an individual level as to whether
yeah,
it's there or not.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And one of the things I like, and this is, I guess, one of my personal stances on it, that so I believe that a group or a team is only as psychologically safe as the least safe person in the group, because I fundamentally feel that psychological safety is, because it is a group phenomenon, it should be considered as a, it should be sort of measured, if you like, as the group. Um, and it's no good having, say, 6 members of a group feeling psychologically safe whilst 2 members are really not. Um, and here we're starting to talk about inclusion, and we need to examine why those 2 members might not feel psychologically safe. Maybe they're just new to the group, and they are not yet familiar with the group norms and behaviors and sort of practices they're in. They haven't been in a group long enough to understand that it is a psychologically safe place. Maybe actually it's the dynamics of the group are a bit messed up, and maybe there's 6 privileged rich white men in the group and 2 less privileged people who for very good reason do not feel psychologically safe in that group because of the behaviors and practices of that group itself. So so there is stuff that we need to do in that group in order to make sure everyone feels safe and everyone feels included, uh, because it's no good just having some members feel safe.
Yeah. Okay. I'm interested to explore behaviors that would appear to be indirect. So I might come back to that one because I think there might be a build on the next question about how do you know it's present or how do you know it's absent?
Yeah, good question. So some of the so there's a few ways of doing this. First of all, listen to what people are saying. So if people are saying things like, "I have an idea," or "I've made a mistake," or "I'd like to challenge that," or they're saying things like "yes and" instead of "okay but," or something like that, then or in fact, if they're saying like, "I made a really big mistake," and they're talking about their mistakes and surfacing them, and examining how the systems of the group can be changed in order to mitigate or prevent those mistakes in the future, that's all that stuff indicates really high psychological safety. Um, there are also a couple of sort of exercise and sort of workshop practices that you can do to measure psychological safety. One is quantitative and uses a survey tool that's based on Amy Edmondson's original work, which is really powerful. But it is a sort of quantitative, or maybe leans towards a sort of academic sort of sense of measuring psychological safety.
Okay,
And
so it might not be sustainable to do repeated.
yeah, and
Okay.
it also has its own problems, because in quantitatively measuring something, you are affecting that thing.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
so we have to be really careful, um, to not inadvertently damage psychological safety or mask it if we're trying to measure it with those sorts of survey tools. Let's not say that survey tools are bad, but they're a very sharp and powerful weapon that need to be, well, weapons may be a wrong word, but yeah, they're a powerful tool that can be misused or misapplied. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so equally, we've talked about blame.
Yeah.
When it's absent or it's lowered, there's some of the sort of behaviours that you observe.
So if it's so when blame so when blame is absent. So actually, there's a concept in that I've seen in tech, and I think it comes from a different domain, but I'm not sure where. But there's blameless and there's blame aware, and arguably blameless is what we're striving for, but is potentially a sort of, because we're humans, maybe an unobtainable goal, because we because we are humans, we're innately sort of wired to try and blame things or people or root causes for something. Um, if we adopt a blame aware approach, which really sort of, which is more about trying to be conscious of when we're starting to blame someone, maybe ourselves, we include ourselves in that. We can, it's sometimes easier to blame ourselves than it is to blame other people. But there's lots of practices, things like retrospectives, debriefs, um, morbidity and mortality conferences, and you know, or post or incident reviews and things like that. Different domains call them all different things. In fact, I'd be interested to hear what you think, what sort of, how this works in the sporting domain. But if those practices exist, and they exist, and they're done well, and they're done at a good cadence, they're carried out at a cadence, they're not, and when I say cadence, I mean they should, the things that drive these sorts of behaviors shouldn't just be when something goes wrong. It's just at the end of a phase of something, or at the end of a meeting, or at the end of a session, or at the end of a week, or at the end of a training session. Those sorts of embedded practices really are sort of really super powerful to build psychological safety and build performance, but they also require a degree of psychological safety to sort of be there in order to work at all, really. But yeah, I'm interested in the sporting world, in, we call them retrospectives in one domain and debriefs in another. Like, how do they work in the sporting world?
I think certainly it's somewhat easier if there is an opposition that directly affects your outcome. So for team-based sports or combat-based sports where they outwitted us on the field of
Mm,
play. So there's an element where actually it's easier to sort of recognize that you've got to trust the process and look at for those mini wins. You've got to be thinking about your the areas that you want to develop. So it keeps that open mind. When it
mm,
is a bit more objective and you've got an outcome, a power output or a time, and you're responsible for how it goes, then you know the outcome dominates quite a lot.
mm,
I think that the biggest lesson that I've found over the years has been when you don't debrief regularly and you get this closing of a mind. So it's very, and I'm very sympathetic to this for a champion's mind, is that when they go from sort of junior level and they start getting some success, they start attributing what they've done to that work. And you think, okay, no, but to get to a Commonwealth medal, it's going to be a completely different process to becoming a world or Olympic champion. And so you need growth between world champion and Olympic champion. You need open mindedness, you need review. But what a champion often does is start saying, well, that got me there.
mm,
And so that's a difficult conversation to sort of overcome when you've got a closing of someone's mind. And the support team too, because they want to help with greater confidence. The pressure starts to go up, and so people start to revert to type. And so over time, high performance systems have evolved naturally to introduce that debriefing earlier in the process. So counterintuitively, or ironically, however you want to put it, is that what you're trying to build is a closed-mindedness about including open-mindedness.
mm. Yeah,
So
yes,
you're trying to
yes,
instill that as that's the habit that I will use coming out of a competition, regardless of win, lose, or draw. It's really annoying when you say we didn't do that bit. Ah, yeah, but we won a gold medal, and it diffuses the inquiry.
yes.
So I think it is much more about recognizing and appreciating effort rather than necessarily the specific outcome. There is a little bit about assuming that someone's perhaps made a mistake rather than malice.
Yeah.
The Halland's razor
Yeah.
approach. When ultimately you are going to have to account for a result.
Yeah.
Um,
This reminds me of because I love the point about success hiding failure, and I often sort of come back to this because um, success can be success can be created through all sorts of you can just get lucky a lot, and that can hide, and it can prevent that introspection into failure. But at the same time, so there's two concepts. Well, there's a couple of concepts called safety one and safety two, and I think these are really powerful to think about as well. Safety one being inspection into what went wrong and trying to prevent the things that went wrong from happening again. So traditional health and safety and a lot of practices in aviation and stuff have adopted safety one. That went wrong. Let's put in a process or mechanism to prevent that happening again. And that does lead to, well, fewer failures to a degree. It can also result in more brittle systems. But safety two is the converse of that, which is looking at successes. What went right, and how do we make those things go right more often? And they're two very interesting lenses with which to look upon that this sort of debriefing or retrospection or introspection, and they're useful at different times. Like if there was an incident, looking at what caused it, but also looking at what went right in that incident, what could have gone even worse. And I imagine, and I wonder if the same things that applies to sport and those sorts of, particularly maybe with individual sports where you maybe I'm sure there are other factors, but you do only primarily have yourself to for want of a better word, blame.
yeah, well, I'm bouncing from Netflix documentaries. I just rewatched Last Dance, Michael Jordan and
Mm,
Chicago Bulls, and maybe I'd come on to that because that's an issue I think a lot of teams work with in it, that it's pressure. I've just started Drive to Survive, the sort of Formula One stories,
yeah.
and whilst it's nicely edited and it all looks sort of very convenient little mini stories, but you can't escape from the vision of a Lewis Hamilton watching back the race, apologizing. I should have taken responsibility there, or I
Mm,
didn't prepare enough for that. Watching back those nuanced aspects of the race of review. So it's an
mm,
immediate aspect. They're still in their suits. They're still at the venue, and that's instilled. And yet I see such an absence in certainly the corporate environment, and I think in underperforming teams,
yeah.
education, where it is an immediacy to bounce from one client to the next or one class to the next. What do you not sit down and ask how it went? Whether you got the bid or not. No,
Yeah.
we just go get on the plane and we're off.
Yeah.
Would it be interesting to find out what your thoughts are about that opportunity? Well, we hadn't even thought about it. For me, it's not just about that sense of creating a culture. There's performance to be had there in that approach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really like your point about the immediacy of it as well. One, there are lots of dysfunctions of teams and organizations. One of those dysfunctions being never doing any sort of retrospective or debriefing or self-examination. Another dysfunction is doing it, but delaying it so much that so say you had a project that completed in March, and no, only now in April you're doing the retrospective. Well, most of your learnings from that will have disappeared into the ether. So and you may well remember stuff wrongly or inaccurately anyway. So it does, this work needs to be put in right now. Like like you said, Lewis Hamilton, that still in his suit, looking at what happened. That's the best time to learn. But it's also the time when people are less inclined to sort of think, right, let's put in some more effort now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, then maybe that's a segue into that sort of concept of the burning platform. This is
Mm,
another common bit of feedback I hear, in which if I reflect on my time in elite sport, uh, whilst I was certain environments, I was fearful of making mistakes.
mm,
Um, I wasn't able to take risks, but I was at my most focused. The quality of my work was very high,
mm,
and if I think about aspects of that performance, probably some of my natural preferences, not to work in a certain way, not to tidy that bit up or not to finish that bit, they were eradicated because I was going to do my work really well, because I had a level of fear that I was going to let somebody down, or actually I would have got roasted by that Olympic champion if I didn't step
mm,
up, or if I wasn't actually delivering. So
mm.
a large part of my work was sort of was dominated by I don't want to mess up. I don't want to put a foot wrong. Um, so what's your thinking about this concept of where pressure and or the burning platform actually drives performance, and how psychological safety can complement or actually work with that?
So I love this. I love this, and it reminds me of so fear isn't necessarily a bad thing. Fear isn't a bad emotion. Like fear gets us, like you're just saying, fear helps us achieve incredible things. Um, Fear of various things. I was once asked by a CEO, um, can a team? Well, in fact, I've been asked this a number of times. Can a team be too safe? Or and this CEO in particular thought that their team was too safe, and now too psychologically safe. And I really strongly believe that there is no such thing as being too psychologically safe. And the example I use is of uh, Nims Dai, the Sherpa mountaineer, and his team, and they're an incredible team. They've achieved incredible feats of mountaineering. They summited K2 in the winter, and K2 kills something like a third of the people that reach its summit. And in winter, it's even more dangerous than that. So they were ascending K2 in the winter, and there's 6 or 7 of them, and statistically maybe half of them should have died on that mountain, and half of them could have expected to die on that mountain. So they must have possessed a real existential fear, like an avalanche or a storm rolling in, or a rockfall, or some mistake or something going wrong could have killed them, maybe killed them all. But they, in their group, they feel so incredibly psychologically safe because they are able to say to each other, yeah, I think we should try this. I think we should try that route. Maybe we should do this. I'd like to, or challenge each other's ideas, and raise concerns. I'm not feeling well. I've got a bit of a headache. Let's slow down, because, and that's the way to success. Because if you're able to do that, if you work, well, the converse, if someone tags, if someone doesn't raise that they've got a headache, maybe they're getting an edema, half an hour later, they're dying. The rest of the team are at risk because they've got to get a dying person down the mountain. So that psychological safety is the vehicle for that huge success of getting to summit and getting back down. More importantly, getting back down. But it's the fear, that existential fear, that without that existential fear, they'd be making mistakes. They'd be making careless errors and stuff. But it's also that fear of not succeeding that drives them to achieve it in the first place.
Hmm.
And for most of us, we're not climbing K2, we're doing other things. But maybe it's the fear of not providing for our family, or the fear of not having a successful career, or the fear of not being able to save enough for retirement. Those are the sorts of, or whatever those fears are, because a fear is just the sort of opposite of a desire, right? So whatever those fears are, they're the things that drive us. But it's psychological safety that is a vehicle within teams to help us achieve it.
Hmm. Interesting, and it's it's got me thinking just about the different mountains we might be climbing, or the different roles we might be playing at different
Mm.
times, that and structures in organisations. So um, some people will feel safe in their team of peers.
Yeah,
We're all right in this team,
yeah.
but culturally, I'd feel unsafe. So, thank you, boss. In our team, I feel fine, and you're protecting me. But I'm not going to put a foot out of line, because up
Mm.
above, it's creating this sense of calcification, or inertia. Or equally, I've encountered situations where actually the leader of the team feels unsafe because he's expecting snipers, or the corridor guerrillas of, we thought we'd agreed something. So I'm curious to get your thoughts about, how do you stratify this and think about psychological safety and guide people to be contextually sensitive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you make a great point, because most organizations, no, all
Yeah,
organizations
oh,
will
yeah.
have, yeah, all
100%
organizations,
done.
they all have different degrees of psychological safety in different pockets and different parts of the business. You'll have one team over here that is super psychologically safe within their team, within their bubble. And maybe they've got a manager who's, being very protective and shielding them. Maybe the rest of the organization on average is not particularly psychologically safe. Maybe there's a team over here with very low psychological safety, proper screamy finger pointy boss over here. But equally, it is very contextual. People, see a bunch of managers together sitting in a room, if they're in the same level of the organization, they regularly work together with their peers, they're going to feel psychologically safe. Suddenly the CFO walks into the room, none of them feel psychologically safe at all. They certainly don't feel safe to admit their mistakes in front of the CFO, who's who has, and it's because the that person has, or can, their presence can result in much higher consequences, for interpersonal consequences, for those sorts of behaviors and activities. Where you've got it between teams, so if so one of the things I talk about managers with is this psychological safety gradient, that is one of the stresses, one of the challenges of a manager. And it's managing your own team, where you're trying to foster an environment of psychological safety. But outside of that team, you're dealing with environments of lower psychological safety, and managing that gradient. So being that membrane between these two environments is a stressful place to be. It's a difficult and it's a hard work place to be. So when we're talking about sort of organizational change, there are various strategies we can try and employ, from things like creating communities of psychological safety, so that good practices, things like retrospectives and debriefs and other good practice team charters and things, can be created across different teams. So we're creating this sort of cross-functional, cross-domain community within an organization that kind of tries to level out and draw everyone up like a rising tide in an organization. But it also needs to be driven from the top. And I often don't like using the word top in terms of
Yeah,
people,
yeah,
but
no, you mean though, the boss, or the boss
yeah,
of
yeah,
the top team.
yeah. And they, sometimes I like to call them the people at the back, um, because that's where they really are. But they need to engage and be driving these sorts of practices and behaviors as well, because ultimately, if they're not, you're still just going to end up with an organization where you've got pockets of safety and people trying to protect those pockets,
Mm.
and that's really hard work. It's a really
Yeah, yeah,
tough place to be.
I'd agree in the sense that it's possible, but it
Mm,
takes a movement, and upward pressure.
mm,
So, what would be your this? I don't. I know that this is extremely complex and it would be circumstantial and contextual. But what would be your sort of top tips if people are starting to think about this area, whether they're in a team, they've still got contributions to be made to start
mm,
somewhere, but
mm.
equally for a leader, where do they start with this?
So yeah, and so that's a really good point, because there are slightly different things you can do as a member of a team or as a leader of a team, but there's certainly commonalities between them. One of the first things to do is, I quite like the phrase, if you want to build psychological safety, pretend it already exists. And if you're in a position of authority or privilege, such as a leader, then that's much easier to do. It's still possible to do as a member of a team, but that involves doing things like admitting your mistakes. So admitting your mistakes is a super powerful way to begin to foster that environment, because what we want is for everyone else to admit their mistakes. So if you've been on the team a long time, or you're an old hat at this, and particularly say so in a sporting context, say if you've got a few medals under your, in your career, and so for Lewis Hamilton to walk into a room of more junior drivers and say, I messed up bad in that race, and this is how I messed up bad in that race, and this race is so bad it's known as the Lewis Hamilton messed up race. And to create an environment where it's safe and encouraged and almost fun to surface mistakes and talk about them and stuff, that's super powerful. That's amazing. So admitting and talking about your own mistakes, really powerful thing to do.
So that requires a bit of vulnerability.
Yes.
You could potentially trade on that. If you're a leader, then you might have a little bit more capacity to give that, rather than perhaps within the group. Also requires encouraging feedback, as in,
Yeah.
give me some feedback. Tell me how I got on.
Yeah.
As a role model in that sense.
Completely. And in fact, on that feedback, so there's one of the things I suggest, or one of the things I do with teams and suggest they do is team charters. And a team charter looks different for every team, but it's a really powerful way of creating cohesion in a team about what that team does. What are the common goals in the team? What are the common values? What are our common behaviors? What are our rituals and ceremonies? What do we do on a regular basis that we enjoy doing? What other teams do we interact with? How do we interact with them? What do we provide to other teams, and what do we take from other teams? What's our role within the business? All of these things and there's some great team charter canvases out there that you can use as templates, but you can basically create your own. And doing that is a super, super powerful way to not only increase team performance, because you're getting better alignment on what you're actually trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, but it creates psychological safety in the team, because a great deal of psychological safety is fostered through predictability and understanding and knowing intrinsically what it means to be on the team. And if I do this, other people on the team will respond like that, like being able to predict within a certain realm what that's going to be, how they're going to behave and react. And so by actually putting that down on paper and saying, and for example, as my feedback led me there, one of those things you might put in the team charter is that we have a precept, a concept, a behavior that is always to ask for feedback and always provide feedback. Or it might be we always ask if you want feedback and offer it if requested. And so that cohesion, and this is a living document. Like, it's not you don't create a team charter and then just put it in a cupboard and forget about it. It lives, and you revisit it, and it evolves, because you're not going to get it perfectly right first time. And the team evolves, so it needs to evolve with the team. Yeah.
So that's something that probably a leader would introduce. We're going to do some team charter work. We're going to do team norms. We're going to do team values. Probably not necessarily something that a team member can volunteer. I think we're going to do a team charter today, boss.
Yeah.
That's going to go down pretty badly, or it will undermine them maybe.
Mm.
But I'm just wondering whether there's any simple little actions that a team member can demonstrate in that team meeting in response to the cut and thrust and daytime discussions, that you'd actually say, yeah, there's something you can really do that makes people look around and think, that's a different type of question. That's helpful for me, because I now feel a little bit more okay to act in a certain way.
Yeah. So I think one of the other things that, and this is something that everyone can do, which is just a little reframing around work and how we do things. And I call it everything as an experiment. or treating everything as an experiment. You might call it treating work as a learning problem rather than an execution problem. The outcome of the point of this is the outcome of the thing you're doing is not the product or the thing you've built. It's the learning and learning how to do it better next time, or learning how to apply those lessons to the next thing you do. And so instead of and you can start doing this by just using the word experiment instead of task or something like that. Like, I'm gonna carry out this experiment and I expect the result to be this, instead of, well, I'm going to do this, which means we'll achieve that. Because none of us really know the outcome of our intended actions. Like, we can't predict the future. So we're all conducting experiments all the time anyway. So let's just call them what they are. And that takes a lot of the risk off the table, because we're kind of explicitly saying everything is an experiment, everything is a risk, nothing might work out the way we expect it to, but let's try it anyway. And so just those little tiny changes in language can really go a long way to making it safer in the team to try things and admit mistakes, build that psychological safety.
The scientist in me loves that, but it also encourages curiosity and the consultative approach of, I'm not sure how this is going to go. I'm setting up my methods, but I don't know the results yet.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. And to a degree, it makes it more fun as well. It makes it more a lot of psychological safety is about enjoying work and enjoying what you do and having fun at work, and it's a lot more enjoyable to be running lots of experiments rather than tasks that might fail or succeed.
I mean, it's such an interesting, an important area, and I think that the wave of uncertainty and change and dynamics, it's not going to go away. And this concept as an idea keeps us so adaptable and responsive to the demands that we're experiencing in the moment, as opposed to, we don't know how the next few years are going to roll out, so we can't be so command and control about how we're going forward.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a couple sort of wrap up questions?
Go for it.
Is that all right? What are you hoping is the legacy from your work?
Oh, that's a good question. In fact, so I've been kind of working on this, and I'm not even that sure, but I would love it if, what I really want is for the world of work to become a more psychologically safe and inclusive place to be. And that's, that would be a great achievement. It would also mean, just like you were saying, that we as a world, as nations, as organizations, as businesses, are more able to adapt and respond to the challenges and changes that we see in the world. The changes, and the challenges that the things that actually break us, or the things that actually damage us or harm us, are the things we don't see coming at all. We've just had a pandemic. We didn't really see that coming. The next big challenge probably won't be a pandemic. It'll be something else. So the best thing that we can do is try to become as adaptable and as resilient, like you're saying right at the start, as we can be, and fostering psychological safety and inclusion is going to help us achieve that. It's going to help us be more resilient.
Love that. Next one then. Who's helped support and champion you?
Oh, fantastic question. So I would have to give Amy Edmondson a shout out for, first of all, introducing me to the term psychological safety. Her book, The Fearless Organization, is absolutely fantastic and really worth a read. And everything that Amy Edmondson does is fantastic strides forward in psychological safety. I would also like to give a shout out to everyone who's involved in the psych safety community. We have a sort of online community and a meetup, and Stephanie and Romy are excellent facilitators who have helped run the last meetup and the next meetups we have. But yeah, everyone on that community are super helpful and really amazing people, and really, I couldn't be doing this work without them. Absolutely superb.
Amazing, amazing. And I'm curious to know what conditions also allow you to do your best work too.
Oh, that's a good question. So I yeah, I work in a number of teams really, and I do almost like almost a bit like my golden hammer is psychological safety. And I have to almost refrain from saying, from looking at everything, well, this is a psychological safety problem.
Okay. What time is it, Tom? I'm glad that you feel safe to ask.
Exactly. I have to remind myself that there are sometimes other challenges to resolve. But for me, alongside psychological safety, we need to have clarity of vision, clarity of our mission, clarity about what is expected of us, what we are trying to achieve, what we are supposed to not be doing, like what we're not, what is outside of our scope and what is inside of our scope. If we can, I'm a strong believer that if we can, in teams, define really accurately what we're trying to do, what our mission is, what is it within our scope of action and what's outside of our scope. If we possess psychological safety and the expertise and capability to actually do the thing, we can achieve anything.
Brilliant. Love it. Fantastic. Look, so enjoyed the conversation and so thankful for you taking a leap of faith of chatting to me about this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, brilliant.
Where can people find more from you?
So the first place to head is psychsafety.co.uk, the website, psychsafety.co.uk, and there I created that a couple of years ago, which just out of all the stuff that I'd already created around psychological safety, and thought I should put this all in one place really, and then it kind of evolved. So there's now a newsletter, a weekly email newsletter, so people can sign up to that and receive all sorts of stuff every week about psychological safety and humanistic leadership and very much related concepts. From psychsafety.co.uk, you can access the online community, so you can join there and meet up with everyone. And on the subject of meetups, we're starting to do a meetup, an online meetup every couple of months. We've just had Nora Jones, the CEO of Jelly.io, speak at the last one, and we've got some great speakers coming up. So there's tons of stuff people can get involved in: newsletter, community, meetup, resources online, and you can reach me at tom@psychsafety.co.uk. I'm always up for a chat, and you can find me online at Tom_Geraghty on Twitter and the other socials and things.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll put those in the show notes so people can access those in a click. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. That's thanks, Steve. This has been a really, really fun podcast to be part of, and I really appreciate the invite. Really
Amazing.
Great.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I really hope you enjoyed this week's conversation. Now, we've got plenty more to come, so if you'd like to support and champion us, then take the time to subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. You can also give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All the links are in the show notes. So in the meantime, have a great week.